Congress votes to impeach President Donald Trump for a second time, accusing him of inciting last week's deadly riot in Washington. Op-ed editor of the New York Post, SOHRAB AHMARI, and Catholic University professor CHAD PECKNOLD are here with analysis. And in the wake of last week's violence, references to the racism of Nazi Germany are being cast about. Are such comparisons apt? President of Pave the Way Foundation, Yuri Krupp, shares his insights. COVID-19 vaccines were released at the end of last year with great fanfare, but how safe are they? And were they developed ethically? Father CHAD Pacholczyk of the National Catholic Bioethics Center will tell us. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. SOHRAB AHMARI, CHAD PECKNOLD, Yuri Krupp, and Father CHAD Pacholczyk are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover. Let's get started. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to impeach President Trump for the second time, an historical first. All this in response to last week's riot and incursion into the U.S. Capitol by Trump supporters that eventually claimed 5 lives, sadly. To discuss this, the fallout, and the road to unity, we're joined by Professor of Systematic Theology at the Catholic University of America, CHAD PECKNOLD, and SOHRAB AHMARI. He's the op-ed editor at the New York Post. Gents, thank you both for being here. On Wednesday, House Democrats voted to impeach the president. Mostly all the Democrats went along, 10 Republicans. But Leader Mitch McConnell has said there is not enough time between now and the inauguration to conduct a Senate trial. SOHRAB, first off, was this a good idea at this point, politically speaking? And what do you think the ramifications might be for Democrats and Republicans?
Well, thanks for having me, and it's rare to have one of your best friends as a co-panelist, so hello to Chad. Look, I think, let me stipulate that President Trump has not conducted himself well since the election. Terribly, especially in the last week, his refusal to initially call off the mob and so forth. I will stipulate all of that. But I still think, it can't look but vindictive that he's getting impeached with 7 days left to go in his term. So what is the point of that? I think for a lot of Trump supporters, and there are 75 million of them, 99.999% of whom did not do the disgraceful acts of besieging the Capitol and so forth. There's just patriotic Americans who agreed with the president's policies. Those people can't but see this combined with the big tech purge and everything else we've seen for the past week or so as an attempt to delegitimize them, and that their choices as political choices, voting for Trump, is somehow a stain on their character, and that Trump has to be just extirpated from the pages of history, which he won't be, but that's what they're trying to do. And so I don't think that will promote the kind of unity that Democrats claim to want going forward.
Yeah. Well, and the other question is, and I've spoken to a number of constitutional scholars and renowned lawyers, the Senate trial may not be able to be conducted after the inauguration. You can't impeach somebody once they've left office.
Right. And so if the point of Democrats, which I'm not crediting this as a point of view, but if their point is to move on from the Trump era, the fact that they're going to have a Trump trial potentially hanging over as a shadow, casting a shadow over, the first few months of the Biden administration, that doesn't seem to suggest them moving on. And the question is, what benefit will that bring them? I mean, my friend Tucker Carlson last night suggested that all that does is paper over the fact that the Democrats are intensely divided among themselves about how to move forward as a party, torn between various, far left and mainstream, quote unquote, left urges. What easier way than to continue the sort of Trump hatred that characterized the party over the past 4 or 5 years? So I think this is just an attempt to kind of extend nostalgia, the Trump era nostalgia, a bit longer, because it helped to unify Democrats in a way that nothing else would be able to going forward.
Yeah. They just can't give them up. Chad, at this point, I was amazed that President-elect Biden tweeted vague support for this impeachment move, saying, well, you can do this, but make sure my agenda moves as well. Is this revenge or justice at this point? And what effect does this have on Biden's call for unity and to not see a red and blue America?
Well, it's clearly an act of revenge by the Democrats, but as SOHRAB says, it's also their only kind of pitch for unity is to be united around hatred of Donald J. Trump. And I think what you see here is, I mean, I drove into the studio in D.C. today, and it's like a militarized zone. If a Trump inauguration was being prepared for in this way, they'd call him a military dictator. The only thing that Biden is prepared for, it seems, is to be the anti-Trump figure. And this is not a cause for national unity at all. America has never been united around political leaders, or they've never been united around their distaste for political leaders. They've been united as a people because of their common loves, because they privilege the family, the community, the worker. These are the things that unite America. Above all, God. One nation under God. This is what brings unity to America, not a second Catholic president in scare quotes, and not an emergency power president who acted badly sometimes. Our unity is going to be found in the really fundamental truths of what it means to be Americans.
The predicate for all of this, we should say, was the idea that Trump incited the violence at the Capitol. I want to play for you both some prominent Pols reacting to the BLM and Antifa riots we saw over the summer. Watch.
The building just collapsed in the midsection, and you hear even some cheers of people.
It's ebbs and flows of violence and looting.
This is a movement, I'm telling you. They're not going to stop. And everyone beware, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day.
You know, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
I don't care that much about statutes.
Shouldn't that be done by shouldn't that be done by a commission or the city council, not a mob in the middle of the night throwing it into the harbor?
People will do what they do.
Now, here are those same politicians reacting to the violence at the Capitol.
USA! USA! USA!
We witnessed two systems of justice. When we saw one that let extremists storm the United States Capitol, and another that released tear gas on peaceful protesters last summer.
This was an attack led and coordinated by white supremacists. It was a violent mob, an attempted coup to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
There are people in our country led by this president, for the moment, who have chosen their whiteness over democracy.
SOHRAB, your take on this. I mean, is the violence and destruction of federal property only wrong when it's committed by ideological opponents? I never heard the word extremism uttered all summer.
Hey, Raymond, I just as you played that, I'm struggling to, I don't know, laugh or cry or whatever the reaction is to that, because that's such astonishing gaslighting. They don't even pretend to try to hide it, right? Because I live in New York City. I happen to remember vividly what I witnessed the night of June 1st and June 2nd in this city. I saw, directly with my own eyes, I saw protesters rampaging down Lexington Avenue, smashing any store, and the cops were too overwhelmed to even begin to respond. I saw them, scouting out my own apartment building as they were going up and down and smashing things. I saw, quote unquote, peaceful protesters running over cops in the Bronx, over officers, beating up officers, and then nationwide, the days-long, months-long assault on a federal courthouse in Portland, the autonomous quote-unquote zone in Seattle, all of that. Now, you can say that this was uniquely heinous what happened last week because it targeted the seat of American democracy as opposed to just private property, as opposed to just a Macy's in Herald Square or a courthouse in Oregon. But there's no denying the fact that for about a year, protesters were told essentially that if you show violence, you can get your political goals. City councils, blue mayors and blue governors will defund the police, and political violence works in a way. And we condemn that consistently, just as we, as the New York Post, but also I individually condemned what happened last week. But those who excused, winked at, denied, and even apologized for the events of last year, as you just pointed out in your montage clip, they have no standing to unequivocally condemn what happened, because they told one segment of society that political violence, as long as your cause is just. And again, the gaslighting makes me, I don't know, cry, laugh, be enraged. I can't quite describe the emotion because they're the way you're being morally lied to.
Chad, the thing that enrages me most is violence is always wrong. Using violence as a means of protest is always wrong. We had state capitals occupied over the summer and siege. Now we have the U.S. Capitol. Your thoughts on what this says to our children when they see the politicians excusing one form of heinous violence while condemning and calling the other Nazis and the Klan in action?
I think it tells our children who's in power. You know, our friend at Harvard Law School, Adrian Vermeule, says it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. It's an attempt to demonstrate for all of us Americans who is in charge, who has the power to use coercive force. And all summer long, we were told that a certain kind of political ideology could use any kind of force it wanted. It could contravene any laws it wanted with the permission of those who hold high office. But anyone who engaged in any kind of foul language, misrepresentation, or indeed violence was deemed as someone who does not even deserve to live in the country anymore, someone who should be extradited, deprived of their livelihood. What it all communicates is who has power. Now, that's the kind of order that you see in totalitarian regimes. That's not a democratic republic in which you have a give and take between citizens, in which you respect your neighbor. Even if you disagree, you respect your neighbor's dignity. And I think what it communicates to our kids is that we don't have a republic, that America is in crisis, and that their future is uncertain.
No, it's deeply troubling. It's deeply troubling, and we have to find a way back here. I guess one of the most disturbing things, I get politicians and ideologues trying to use this crisis to broad brush and brand their political opponents and try to take them down. Understood. But now that has metastasized and spread throughout American life. Now we have a handful of liberal Catholic media organizations, Catholic organizations, that have chosen to brand people in the Catholic community, brothers and sisters in faith, for, quote, culpability in last week's insurrection, saying that mostly conservative Catholics have blood on their hands. Some included in the list are former Attorney General William Barr, Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Catholic League President Bill Donahue, Abby Johnson, the pro-life advocate, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, Cardinal Raymond Burke, Bishop Joseph Strickland of Tyler, Texas, several Catholic priests, Catholic media organizations, even yours truly made the list. I mean, last time I checked, Amy Coney Barrett wasn't, inciting people to storm Capitol Hill. Maybe I missed that. SOHRAB, first you, your take on this and this decision to demonize fellow Catholics for political purposes. What's going on here?
I mean, it's not it's predictable, unfortunately, that the polarization that rips our society, unfortunately, touches the church as well. You know, when just one of the names that you picked out, I mean, I know Raymond, you're not an insider, and you know, we're friends, but you know, when I hear about Cardinals Burke and Dolan, those are both honorable churchmen, and I especially want to talk about Cardinal Dolan because he happens to be my shepherd here in New York. You know, His Eminence has been, you know, nothing but calm in response to desecrations against St. Patrick's Cathedral by, you know, quote unquote Black Lives Matter activists and Antifa types. Right. Time and again, you know, he wrote an op-ed for us in the New York Post where he said, you know, I remember Dagger John, my predecessor of blessed memory, you know, the Archbishop John Hughes, you know, how he would respond to mob violence against Catholics by know-nothings in the 19th century. But that's not the path I'm taking. You know, I'm taking the path of reason, which the church has always championed, you know, unabashedly. And so, you know, to throw all these names together and to attempt to somehow tie anyone who expressed the conservative point of view, or in the case of the Cardinals, just the church's point of view, the church's perennial teaching, and frame that as somehow culpable and related to this, is just more of the same gaslighting that we talked earlier about in the show.
Chad, these people seem to prize ideology above doctrine or belief, and they're incensed that. And if you read the follow-on to these calls to censure and get rid of these people from public life, they really take issue with innocent human life being a preeminent issue for the church. This is a constant theme here. What should be the approach here? What is really happening, Chad?
Well, I think on one level we have to recognize that this is why the church continually makes appeals to the common good and to build up societies, because if we don't have a good society that the church can work with, we'll have a society that is working at cross purposes with the church. And I think what we have is a number of Catholics, prominent Catholics in major cities, who have been compromised by woke ideology. And they have put that power ahead of the truth of the Catholic Church. And they want the truth of the Catholic Church to bend to meet the power that be it. And this is a kind of upside down order. Now, nature can tolerate an upside down order for a while, but it doesn't tolerate it for very long. And I think we're going to see a kind of reaction to that, which is very dangerous. I think this is a very, very dangerous for prominent Catholic liberals to stand up and make the church into this plaything, this political plaything to serve woke interests.
I agree. No, well, the hit lists I found particularly disturbing. And SOHRAB, when Trump came into power, there were no attempts to liquidate opposing voices, certainly not within the Catholic community. You know, so my sense of this is we're moving into a really dark place where even faith, politics has been allowed to take the place of God in many ways in some of these people's minds. And that I find most disturbing. They use the faith as a political weapon, and it can't be that way. Look, people can disagree, you can vote how you want, but the truth is eternal. The truth doesn't move.
Yes, but the truth can be repressed. As Chad alluded to, the truth can be repressed for some time. It can never be eternally repressed, but it can be disguised, obfuscated, and censored. And so I just want to briefly mention this factor, which is that we haven't talked about, is all of this is happening against the backdrop of massive technologically empowered censorship, the likes of which we haven't seen in the history of this country before. You know, the sort of searing event of the past few months for me is neither the election nor the upheaval at Capitol Hill, but the fact that, you know, we at the New York Post had reported an accurate story. Everyone now acknowledges that it was an accurate story about the president-elect's son and his corrupt dealings with essentially foreign powers, and Twitter and Facebook managed to just disappear that from vast swaths of the internet. And we were the tip of the spear. We bore the brunt of that, and we were banned for days. And then eventually they relented. But then after the election, especially the last week, they've widened the scope of who gets to be purged. And so, I think all of this is, you're right, is just taking us in a very dark place. I absolutely want to ditto Chad's allusion to our friend Adrian's motto, in a way, that don't call it hypocrisy. It gets tiresome to use the word hypocrisy. It's a real hierarchy. They're just sort of, because violence, disgusting rhetoric, you can find it on Twitter all over. Right. It's only certain kinds certain kinds of viewpoints that get targeted, and that's the hierarchy. And the sooner we wise up to that, the sooner at least we can deal with reality instead of pretending like this is the same old world of the 1990s or early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. No, and it's funny. Twitter's going to protect the Republic from the President of the United States, but there's no presumption to protect the American people from China, Iran. These official organs continue to operate on Twitter and Facebook as if it's just another day and there's no problem at all. It's an unbelievable moment we've reached, and they have way too much power. They should be broken up, and I hope that movement, looks like there's a bipartisan movement to break up these monopolies. They should be broken up. Chad, what do you think lies ahead for the Catholic Church and Catholics under a Biden administration? And before I get your answer, Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York had this to say about President-elect Biden earlier this week. He said, "Our new president, who speaks with admirable sensitivity about protecting the rights of the weakest and most threatened, ran on a platform avidly supporting this gruesome capital punishment for innocent preborn babies." Your thoughts?
Well, that, of course, is a very savvy comment from His Eminence. Of course, this is what's going to have to be our modus operandi as Catholics, is utilizing one point of agreement to force a conversation about a point of real disagreement. So there's a kind of a shared assumption about the death penalty. Liberals are against the death penalty. The Holy Father has taught us about the impermissibility of the death penalty, and Cardinal Dolan, I think very smartly, said, well, we have the death penalty in this country under the widespread practice of abortion, and I think that's going to have to be our modus operandi, unfortunately, is to show how one aspect of the liberal ideology agrees with the Church's teaching, and that aspect is in contradistinction and disagreement with an even more fundamental truth, that we protect human dignity itself in the womb at the beginning. So I think that's the right strategy. I think the weakness is a tendency to try to be a both-and kind of Catholic, in which you say, well, the Catholic Church is neither liberal nor conservative. That's true. But there's a kind of, speaking of hierarchy, there's a kind of hierarchy to the truths that we have to argue for. And so I think the bishops are right to stress that what we are fighting for now and always is the human dignity in the womb, and to say that that is actually more important than what we have to say about the very minor numbers of cases where you actually see the death penalty against, say, 2,000 lives lost in the womb every day in America. So I think that's going to have to be our highest priority going forward. I think we're going to have to tolerate, to some extent, this constant flouting of our second Catholic president. Second Catholic president happens to be the most pro-abort president in history. And we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with the confusion that comes from that. We're going to have to deal with priests and bishops who don't pay attention to that fact. And that's going to be difficult for the Church in America.
I only have a moment left. I'm going to give each of you a shot at this. What can we do at this moment to unify the country in the midst of this viciousness, the violence we've seen? How do we bring Americans back together beyond the hateful politics that we're surrounded in? SOHRAB, you very quickly.
I will just say that, I mean, it's cliche in some ways to say that on EWTN, but it's also an absolute unshakable truth, which is that we have to believe in the power of prayer. We really do, and I say that first foremost for myself, to pray more, to pray more, more, and more.
All right. Chad?
Yeah,
last word.
Pope Leo XIII said that that the Catholic Church will give America her best citizens, and I think SOHRAB's point is right, that her best citizens are those who pray and who point to God, who's the source of unity. This is what America really needs. It doesn't need to be pointed to a politician, it needs to be pointed to God.
I agree. No, we've got to get past politics and to the things that truly unite us: God, family, and one another. Thank you both for being here. You can find SOHRAB AHMARI's columns and all the great op-eds over there at the New York Post at nypost.com. And you can follow CUA Professor CHAD PECKNOLD at @CPecknold. Thank you both.
Thanks a lot.
Now, I grew up in Austria. I'm very aware of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. It was a night of rampage against the Jews carried out in 1938 by the Nazi equivalent of the Proud Boys. Wednesday was the day of broken glass right here in the United States.
That was actor and former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, relating the events of last week to the horror of Kristallnacht. Now, here to discuss the Capitol rioting last week and the frequent comparisons being made to Nazi Germany is the founder and president of the Pave the Way Foundation, Gary Krupp. Gary, thank you for being here. Now, look, you're a Jewish scholar. You've studied this period extensively, particularly as relates to World War II, the Nazi incursion throughout Europe, and Pius XII. Before we address the comparison made by Mr. Schwarzenegger, tell us a little about Kristallnacht, what it actually was. What happened in 1938?
Yeah, it was thanks for having me, Raymond. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. But
thank you.
November 9th and November 10th, 1938. This was actually attacks that were committed by racists, bigots, and anarchists, encouraged by the inaction and silence of the politicians of the day and the city governments. And essentially, that gave their blessings to these rampaging groups going through the city, smashing windows of Jewish-owned businesses, and looting and doing all of this terrible damage, and really just feeding into this frenzy. The problem with the statement.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so the problem with the statement of the governor is that the actual Kristallnacht occurred here in the United States all summer long, in Portland, in Seattle, in New York City, and in Baltimore. Actually, the definition of it, you had inaction by the city, inaction by the politicians, rampaging groups of fascists or Antifa and these other groups going through and smashing windows and looting, and really no major attempt to arrest these people. So that was actually the actual Kristallnacht of the United States. I don't think Washington even comes close.
Well, Schwarzenegger was comparing Trump voters, particularly the Proud Boys, some of whom the founders are Hispanic and African American, but he compared them to anti-Semites and Nazis who persecuted Jewish people in the lead up to World War II. In your opinion, is that a responsible comparison, in your opinion?
I absolutely not. It is not. This was not something that was aimed at certainly at the Jewish people that we had during the Nazi period. But the Proud Boys, this is not. I'm not really that familiar with the group, to be honest with you. We stay very apolitical with Pave the Way, and we try to stay away from these situations. But absolutely, it's a very, very bad comparison. I would say Antifa and other groups may very well fit that category, but as I said, I think that's an unfair comparison.
Also this week, President-elect Joe Biden weighed in on the rioters, and Senators Cruz and Hawley. He used this increasingly common racism, Nazi Germany analogy, and I'm concerned about the way this is moving through the body politic and becoming normalized. Listen to this.
Bunch of thugs, insurrectionists, white supremacists, anti-Semites. 6N is not enough. I mean, come on. You know, these shirts they're wearing, these are a bunch of thugs. And they're terrorists, domestic terrorists.
Should Senator Cruz or Senator Hawley resign?
I think they should be just flat beaten the next time they run. I think the American public has a real good, clear look at who they are. They're part of the big lie. The big lie. I was being reminded by a friend of mine, and maybe you were with me, I can't recall, when we were told that, you know, Goebbels in The Great Lie, you keep repeating the lie, repeating the lie.
Gary, your thoughts on that? You've spoken and written about this tactic at length in regards to the Vatican in your research on Pius XII. What are we seeing here?
Well, unfortunately, all of the promises made during the campaign, which we're hearing from this, is healing the country and bringing the country together. And remarks like this are definitely not doing that. Again, they keep dividing us and separating us, and it's a very, very sad situation. I really wish that they would tone down this language and start healing the country and bringing us together. Certainly, what happened with us during World War II and so on, and he's making basic statements which are correct. You know, the lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. But This is exactly what happened all summer long, and with the rioting that occurred here, that it's peaceful demonstrations and so on, and this is not what happened. But again, we keep saying it over and over again, and that's because of the way it was being treated by the media, unfortunately.
Yep. And look, there's no doubt there were some people wearing anti-Semitic. I saw the anti-Semitic T-shirts in some of these images. Those individuals should be decried, condemned, and if they broke the law, as this one did, he should be prosecuted as such. But I worry when you broad brush an entire group of people, including Hispanics, blacks, whites, Jewish people who were part of that rally before this incursion, that you demonize them, you diminish them and their humanity. Your take on that and
Yes.
what we're seeing.
You're 100% right. And again, this is a terrible effort to divide us. All this is doing is dividing us. And every time you bring up one group versus another group and so on, it serves a very, very bad agenda. We have to start healing the country. We have to start ending these conflicts between groups and so on. That's what was promised to us with this election, that we really need to do this. And there's during the war, there was a Lutheran theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm sure you're aware of who he was.
Yes.
And what he said was he was an anti-Nazi, and he was actually hanged by the Nazis in 1945. But Bonhoeffer said something. He said that when we're talking about a lot of these governments and politicians that are silent during these really bad times, and then now they're saying things to further instigate problems, he said that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And this is what we see happening here, and it seems to be getting worse and worse. And what we have to do is start healing, start bringing the groups together, stop with these divisive remarks, and all they are, they have their own political agendas, and it's a very, very distressful thing because, it's, a lot of this stuff goes back a long, long time to an effort that was made. This is actually, and I had mentioned this once before, that many times, that over the last 60 years, there has been a major attempt to destabilize and to demoralize this country by the KGB then, now the FSB. And, we discovered this during the Pius XII research that we were doing.
Really?
After all, oh, yes, that 1950, he died in 1958. 1963, we saw the Russians act to destroy his reputation, and very, very effectively. And through that, we found this one man, and I'm urging all of your listeners to Google this guy. His name is Yuri Bezmenov, Bezmenov. Yuri Bezmenov was a high-ranking KGB agent who defected in 1970 to the United States. He gave a 1984 interview about how the KGB at that time, and now the FSB, is working to destabilize this country. And this has been going on for over 60 years. And it impacts everything. But if you listen to this guy, and he died in 1993, it really is a warning, but it's something you really need to think. If you want to understand why all of this is happening, and why is there so much hatred, and why is there so much division, and why are there people disrespecting the flag and the country? And this is the reason. This was the effect of this. We've got 3 generations of people who have gone to, spent $60,000 a semester to go to school to be educated by teachers who have been impacted by this. And these people are embedded all over the country. That's where you see these very, very bad remarks and terrible statements that are being made to exacerbate and try to make this situation, a bad situation, worse.
Well, it inculcates a hate of the country and the hatred of fellow man and even your own family, which we're seeing now. I mean, it's the most insidious thing, Gary. It's awful.
And if you listen to the interview, 1984 interview, he's telling you, he says, look, this has been going on for years. And the interviewer says, how can we stop this? He said, you would have to start right now, and it's going to take you 40 years to get 2 generations of patriotic-minded students and so on to rebuild the country. Now, when I went to school, I'm 73 years of age. I went to school. I said the Pledge of Allegiance every day. We'd have assembly, and we would say the Psalms in a public school. And we would have this respect. Believe it or not, we have schools today that these kids don't even know what the Pledge of Allegiance is. And then you see some of these actions where they're disrespecting the flag and so on. And this is the effect of the destabilizing and demoralizing of this country by, at that time, the Russians, the KGB, and the FSB. And by the way, when he talks, he mentions this. He said that 85% of their budget for espionage is based on this exact process of destabilizing and demoralizing their enemy. And they do it effectively. Wow. They're chess players, very, 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 very smart. It's just
Gary, last year, the Vatican announced it had reopened its archives to scholars just as the pandemic shut them down. But not without controversy. There was an eruption when a few documents were released out of context. What's the current status of the archives vis-a-vis that World War II period? And what do you predict will be found there regarding the efforts of Pius XII on behalf of the Jewish people?
Well, first of all, we found that the archives are open now. I spoke to them yesterday, actually. They are, with restrictions and number of people that can go into the archives. But what happened was there was one little document which was already known that was blown up by a critic of Pius XII, and it went all over the place, all over the world and so on. And it was absolutely repudiated by the scholars that we have dealt with, Professor Napolitano, Professor Johann X. And what's happening now is that, for example, the archivist for the Historical Archives, the Secretary of State, Professor X, had he just wrote a very, very complex book on Pius XII and the Jews and all of the work that the Pope had done to save Jewish lives. And this is because he knew, as the archivist for many archives, he had all of these documents, but he couldn't release them. Right. He couldn't speak about them until the embargo was lifted. It is coming up. Everything is happening now. We're very, very positive. And I have to point something out. We're not real scholars, and we're not experts as much, as some may think we are. But what we did, which a lot of these so-called historians did not do, is that we went to different dioceses. We went to Assisi, Campania. We went to Austria, to Vienna, went to different dioceses, and we went into their archives, and we asked to see wartime documents. We found tens of thousands of wartime documents before the archives were open, free to learn about this. And some of them are very, very effective, especially the actions of Pius XII on October 16, 1943, where the invasion of the Jewish ghetto and the arrest of the Jews, where he acted immediately to end the arrest at 2 o'clock the same day they started, and then proceeded to hide and request hiding the Jews, which were actually up to 12,000 in Rome. throughout Italy and throughout all of the ecclesiastical houses. We have proof of this. And this came from little individual archives. For example, an Augustinian nun, we have a handwritten diary entry in October of 1943, which says, we were asked by the Holy Father to protect the Jews and name the Jewish people that they took in. Handwritten. These documents and this information has been available for decades, but nobody has bothered to look. That's the frustrating part about this, perpetuating this, this terrible, reputation and destruction of Pius XII's name, his good name, and his reputation.
Well,
so
Gary Krupp, I disagree with you. Gary Krupp, I think you are a scholar. You've gone into these archives when others wouldn't, and you're revealing the truth. That is a scholar, and I thank you for doing it. Thank you for your insights as well, and we'll check up with you in the days ahead. Gary Krupp, the president of Pave the Way Foundation, you can follow him at ptwf.org and on Twitter at Gary Krupp. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks so much, Raymond. Take care. Thank you.
COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna were rolled out at the end of last year, and more vaccines are on the way. There's been a great deal of uncertainty and confusion about the safety of those vaccines and were they manufactured and tested ethically. And what should Catholics keep in mind when considering which vaccine to take? Here to separate fact from fiction is the Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father CHAD Pacholczyk. Father, Happy New Year. Thanks for being with us. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines both used cell lines during laboratory testing derived from an abortion, but neither used the abortion-derived cell lines in the actual production of the vaccine. Is that morally acceptable, then, for Catholics to take them?
Well, you see, Raymond, you're right in making that distinction because I think a lot of people say to themselves, if I'm going to get the jab in the arm and what I get put inside me had some contact with these cells, that seems worse than if they were involved in just some lateral, side testing that occurred. So that distinction is something that has been discussed quite a bit in the wake of the development of all of these vaccines. And the Church in general is saying to people, when there is this association with cell lines from abortion, if you have access to a vaccine that is more distantly connected or not connected at all, that obviously would be a preferable choice to, for example, a vaccine that's actually manufactured using these cell lines. So we want to keep some distance from this to the extent that that's possible, but in some cases it may not be possible. And what the Vatican has said recently is, in the face of a proportionate reason, you can receive these vaccines even if they were produced in that manner by relying on these cell lines from abortions.
Yeah, and both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis have received the vaccine this week. Why would a pharmaceutical company use an abortion-derived cell line to develop a vaccine? Just curious.
The reason is, believe it or not, simple utility. In other words, these cell lines, they have become distributed everywhere. They're ubiquitous. Researchers at universities use them. Big Pharma uses them. Everybody's just kind of gotten used to it. And that's a shame. This is really, I think this COVID-19 pandemic offers us an opportunity to push back against that. More and more people are realizing, oh, there's a connection to abortion. I had no clue. And this is what, at the center, at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, we're encouraging people, write letters to the manufacturer of these vaccines, push back in other ways, make it clear that this is something that is an affront to conscience. We shouldn't be having science rely upon cell lines that came from direct abortions, even if it's true, which it is, that those abortions happened in the last century. There are only 2 cell lines that are used for vaccine productions, and those abortions happened in 1972 and in 1985. So that's a long time ago, but nonetheless, it's still not fair to all of us as end users to rely on those cell lines.
Now, there were about 15 companies making this COVID-19 vaccine, which is why it's hard to track them, of which 6 of those are using aborted-derived cell lines in the development and production of the vaccine itself. Now, I have a chart here I want the audience to see. Can a Catholic or anyone who's not interested in receiving a vaccine that's been produced with these abortion-derived cells, can they request a vaccine from a company or a different company based on their religious beliefs? And who should they go with? What's the safe vaccine? What's the vaccine you're recommending here?
Well, you know, at this point, Raymond, we don't actually have that many choices. So I think that's going to change in coming months. We're going to have more and more coming into the market. And, you know, each country is going to be a little bit different. So, for example, in Brazil, you will have access to a Chinese-manufactured COVID vaccine. That vaccine is not available in the U.S. So what people should do is check the availability first of, you know, what are their options. And there's going to have to be an assessment for each individual about, you know, how much risk am I at? And certainly for the elderly population, they are at higher risk. The statistics indicate that quite clearly and definitively, and they are good candidates to be first in line to get this vaccine. So they should talk with their doctors, find out, you know, what is available, and if they have some choices, then they should check and consult, for example, with the chart that you mentioned, and choose the one that has the least association. But if they don't have a choice, you know, and sometimes there's another issue here, Raymond, which is that not all these vaccines have the same efficacy. We've seen numbers above 90% for the Moderna, and meanwhile for AstraZeneca, it appears it's more in the range of 60, you know, maybe 70%. So that can affect the decision by an individual if they're saying, you know, I only want to get vaccinated once and I want to be sure it has the best chance of working. Then that will be part of weighing those proportionate reasons for getting vaccinated with a particular manufacturer's vaccine.
Pope Francis received his first dose, as I mentioned earlier, of the COVID vaccine this week. In an interview with Italian media on Sunday, he had this to say about people taking the vaccine. He said, I believe that ethically everyone should be vaccinated because you are playing with your health life and also with the lives of others. I don't know why someone is saying no, that the vaccine is dangerous. But if the doctors are introducing it as something that will work and that doesn't have special dangers, why not take it? There is a suicidal negativism that I'm not able to explain, but today the vaccine needs to be taken. Father Tad, that sounds an awful lot like a mandate from the Pope.
Yeah, maybe on a first glance, but I think what he's really saying is if the risks here are low and it appears to be safe as confirmed by extensive testing, this affords a very helpful benefit to public health. And it means that all of us should look at this closely. And, you know, he's also mentioning the kind of suicidal negativity, I think was the phrase you mentioned, that sometimes people have a kind of generalized fear or hesitation around vaccines without carefully scrutinizing the incredible advantages and blessings, really, that they have brought to all of our health, to public health generally.
Father Tad, have you seen any data on what these vaccines might do to our natural innate immune system and reaction and resistance to COVID itself? I mean, what does it do to these T-cell immune individuals, and what might that impact be? Do we know?
Well, I would say at this point, the early testing that has been done has been on fairly large groups, meaning tens of thousands of people. And thus far, there have not been significant contraindications, significant problems or side effects. Now, does that mean that there won't be in the future? That you can never say with certainty. So could this trigger some aberrant immune responses later in a few people? Yes, that is possible. You know, in the past, there have been some vaccines that have been developed, not for COVID, but for other things. And one or two of those had some complications. Like one of them, in maybe 1 out of 100,000 people, so super rare, caused narcolepsy, where people would suddenly fall asleep and lose control, kind of brain problems. But, you know, that kind of thing at a rate of 1 to 100,000, it's pretty uncommon, and it makes a lot of sense with a good safety profile otherwise to still look seriously at that possibility of getting vaccinated.
Across the country, more than 9.3 million vaccine doses have been administered out of a total of 27.6 million that were distributed. Now, the Trump administration on Tuesday announced several big changes to its COVID-19 distribution strategy. They're calling on states to expand immediately the pool of people eligible to receive these vaccines to those 65 and older and those with underlying health conditions. The second change is that vaccine doses originally given to states based on their total adult population, starting in the next 2 weeks, will now be distributed based on the number of people who are over 65 years of age. Now, the goal is to have 1 million people vaccinated in the U.S. per week. Is that a reasonable goal, Father, for vaccine distribution?
Whew, that's a hard question. I think that that's a logistical type question. And I think part of the idea here is that we don't want to see vaccine samples going to waste. And there are some challenges here in the sense that some of these vaccines require a double dose. And you and I both know it can be hard enough to get people to show up for the first dose, much less the second dose. And so you don't want to have a situation where you're sort of holding in reserve that second dose and then people don't show up and then, you know, you don't utilize them and have to throw them away because some of them do degrade with time. So it makes sense here to try to accelerate this as much as possible. I mean, the specific number you cite really will depend on, you know, are we going to go to the local drugstores and use them as outlets? Are we going to be setting up large venues in which people can easily get access? How difficult is it going to be, for example, if people have to go to a website and sign up all kinds of information ahead of time and the website is crashing and maybe they're elderly on top of it and they don't even know how to use computers? That's going to, you know, push people away from getting vaccinated rapidly. So it's a logistical question, and it makes sense to reduce unnecessary barriers.
No, well, now, this week, Disneyland, you saw, was turned into a COVID vaccine distribution center. So I guess they're going to use these big venues that are basically empty now to move people through. That seems to me a smart strategy. Moving to a different topic, Father, before we go, Pope Francis made some news this week. He issued a motu proprio on Monday, modifying canon law regarding women's access to the ministries of Lector and Acolyte. In the document Spiritus Domini, the Pope changed church law so that women can formally be instituted as lay ministers of Lector and Acolyte, those ministries rather. The Pope modified the phrase in Canon 230 of the Code of Canon Law from laymen to lay persons. However, he stipulates the conferment of such a role does not entitle them to support or remuneration from the church. Father, you've served as a parish priest, pastor. What are your thoughts? I mean, we've seen women lectors for decades in the church. What does this really change?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it changes a lot. It seems, in one sense, that it is an effort to convey kind of goodwill towards the important contributions that women make in the church. But I think it does raise this kind of broader question that comes up every so often in the church, Raymond, and I'm sure you run into it a lot. Is it important for us to kind of laicize clergy, have clergy become administrators and handle kind of worldly things, and do the opposite, which is to clericalize the lay people and turn them into kind of pseudo-ministers? Is that really the appropriate role and direction here that the church should be moving? Or, perhaps when we're talking about the unique contributions of women, that here we identify that they do indeed have some very particular gifts that benefit the whole church, and promote those, in other ways apart from specific kinds of ministerial designations like this, which may be even potentially on the superficial side.
We'll leave it there. Father Tad, thank you for your commentary, and you can learn more about those ethical profiles of the COVID vaccines on the National Catholic Bioethics Center website, ncbcenter.org. I'll also tweet out that chart we had earlier. Thank you so much, Father Tad.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you, Raymond. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And The World Over is now available as a podcast. You can download us at iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. That's all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.